Many people hear the word court case and immediately think it is only relevant to lawyers. But this case is different. This case affects every citizen, every voter, every student, every profession, every government, every political party, every generation. Because this case answers a fundamental question: who is most powerful, parliament or the constitution itself? Can elected governments change everything they want, or are they limited? Can democracy protect itself from future misuse of power, or can constitutional safeguards eventually disappear? The answers to these questions were shaped by Keshavananda Bharati judgment. To understand how we got there, we must travel back to beginning of independent India. The year was 1947. The India had finally achieved independence after nearly 200 years of British rule. The nation celebrated freedom, but independence brought enormous challenges. India was politically free, yet socially and economically many problems remained. Poverty was widespread, literacy was high, infrastructure was limited, economic inequality was severe. The leaders of newly independent India faced an enormous responsibilities. They had to build a nation not just politically but socially and economically as well. And one of the biggest challenges was land ownership. At the time of independence, large amount of agricultural land were concentrated in the hand of relatively small number of landlords. Millions of farmers worked on these lands. Many had little ownership, little security, and very little economic power. This created enormous inequality. Indian leaders believed that independence would be incomplete if economic justice remains absent. Many policymakers argued that land ownership needed to be redistributed more fairly. They believed land reforms were essential for building a more equitable society, but implementing those reforms would soon create a constitutional conflict. State governments across India began introducing land reforms laws. The goal was simple: reduce concentration of land ownership, provide greater opportunities for farmers, promote social and economic justice. Many citizens welcomed these reforms, but others objected. Landowners argued that these laws affected their constitutional rights. They claimed their property rights were being violated. As soon difficult questions emerged: could governments restrict individual rights in order to achieve broader social justice? The question would eventually reach the Supreme Court. Now, India faced a constitutional dilemma. On one side stood fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution. On the other side stood social reforms, the government's efforts to reduce inequality and improve society. What should happen when these two goals come into conflict? Could Parliament change constitutional provisions to achieve social justice? Or were some rights beyond Parliament's reach? No one had a clear answer, and soon the court were forced to decide. As constitutional disputes increased, one question began to dominate legal discussions: can Parliament amend the Constitution? At first, the question seemed straightforward. Of course, the Parliament could make laws, but constitutional amendments were different. The Constitution was not a ordinary law, it was the supreme law of the land. Could Parliament modify every part of it? Could it amend fundamental rights? Could it change the every framework of constitution, or were they limited? The Supreme Court would soon begin answering the questions, and each answer would bring new controversy. The first major constitutional battle arrived in 1951. The case was called Shankari Prasad versus Union of India. The issue was whether Parliament could amend fundamental rights. The Supreme Court ruled in Parliament's favor. The court held that Parliament possessed the authority to amend the Constitution, including fundamental rights. For the moment, the matter seemed settled. Parliament had broad amendment powers, but the debate was far from over. Several years later, a similar challenge reached the Supreme Court. This was Sajjan Singh case. Once again, the court largely supported Parliament's power to amend the constitution. The earlier position was reaffirmed. Parliament continued to enjoy broad constitutional amendment authority. Yes, beneath the surface, doubts were beginning to emerge. Some judges started asking difficult questions. If Parliament can amend fundamental rights today, what might stop a future Parliament from weakening them tomorrow? The seed of future Parliament constitutional crisis had been planted. Then came a dramatic turning point. In 1967, the Supreme Court delivered its judgment in the Golaknath case. This time, the court changed direction. The majority held that Parliament could not amend fundamental rights. The ruling shocked the political establishment. For the first time, Parliament's amendment powers appeared restricted. Supporters celebrated the decision as a victory of individual liberty. Critics argued that it would make social reforms far more difficult. The conflict between parliament and judiciary intensified, and the constitutional debate entered a completely new phase. Parliament was not prepared to accept the restrictions imposed by Golaknath. Political leaders believed that constitutional amendments were necessary for social and economic progress. They argued that elected representatives should have the authority to shape the nation's future. As a result, Parliament responded with constitutional amendments designed to restore its power. The confrontation between Parliament and judiciary was now unavoidable. Both institutions believed they were protecting the Constitution, but they disagreed fundamentally about where constitutional power should be reside. The stage was set for one of the greatest constitutional battles in India history, and soon an unlikely petitioner from Kerala would bring that battle before the largest bench ever assembled in the Supreme Court of India. His name was Swami Keshavananda Bharati. At the center of this historic constitutional battle stood an unlikely figure, not a prime minister, not a cabinet minister, not a political leader, not even constitutional lawyer. His name was Swami Keshavananda Bharati. He was the head of the Ednir Mutt, a Hindu religious institution located in Kasaragod region of Kerala. For generations, the Mutt had owned land and managed religious and educational activities. Like many religious institutions across India, the Mutt was affected by land reforms legislation introduced by the Kerala government. At first glance, this appeared to be an ordinary legal dispute, a disagreement over property, a disagreement over land ownership. Nothing about it suggested that it would eventually become one of the most important constitutional cases in world history. Yet, history often begins in unexpected places. What started a local dispute in Kerala would soon raise questions about the future of Indian democracy itself. When the Kerala Land Reforms Act affected property owned by the Ednir Mutt, Swami Keshavananda Bharati approached the court seeking relief. Initially, the challenge force focused on the importance of legislation on much property rights. However, events were unfolding elsewhere in India. The conflict between Parliament and Supreme Court had already intensified after the Golaknath judgment. Parliament had responded by passing constitutional amendments designed to restore its power. As lawyers began examining these amendments, the case expanded far beyond land ownership. The focus shifted. The question was no longer simply about property. The question became, what are the limits of Parliament's power to amend the Constitution? Could Parliament amend any provision? Could it change fundamental rights? Could it alter the identity of Constitution itself? A local dispute had now transformed into the constitutional revolution. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, several historical questions demanded answers. Can Parliament amend every part of the Constitution? Can fundamental rights be amended? Can Parliament remove constitutional protections? Are there any limits to amendment powers? Who ultimately protects the Constitution? Parliaments or the Supreme Courts? These questions were unlike ordinary legal disputes. These answers would affect every future government, every future parliament, every future citizen. The court understood the gravity of situation. This was no longer simply another constitutional case. It was a case about the future of constitutional governance itself. Recognizing the importance of issues involved, the Supreme Court assembled the large constitutional bench in Indian history, 13 judges. Even today, it remains the largest bench ever constituted by the Supreme Court of India. Think about that for a moment. 13 of a nation's most senior judges sitting together to answer a single constitutional question. The very size of bench reflected the importance of issues before the court. The judges understood that whatever decision emerged would influence India for generations. History was about to be written. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was extraordinary. Some of India's greatest legal minds appeared before the court. Senior advocates, constitutional experts, government representatives, scholars of constitutional law, all gathered to debate a single issue. Could Parliament possess unlimited constitutional power, or must constitutional power itself be limited? For months, legal argument filled the courtroom. Every article, every parliament, every precedent, every constitutional principle was carefully examined. The future relationship between parliament and the constitutional hung in the balance. The hearing continued for 68 days. At time, it became one of the longest constitutional hearings in the East Indian history. Thousands of pages of argument were presented, historical records were examined, constitutional debates were reviewed, comparisons were made with constitutional system around the world. The judges listened patiently, day after day, week after week, month after month. This was not merely a legal argument, it was a debate about the nature of constitutional democracy itself. What should happen when the democratic power conflicts with constitutional safeguards? How should a nation balance change and stability? The court searched for answers. Parliament's position was straightforward. The constitution was created to serve the people. Society changes, economic conditions change, national priorities change. Therefore, the constitution must also be capable of change. Parliament argued that elected representatives should possess broad amendment powers. Without such powers, important reforms could become impossible. Land reforms, economic reforms, social justice initiatives, all might be blocked by constitutional limitations. Parliament insisted that amendment powers were necessary to fulfill the Constitution's promises. Its argument was powerful. A constitution that cannot adapt may eventually become irrelevant. This was Parliament's version, a flexible constitution capable of involving. The Supreme Court viewed the issue from a different perspective. The judges asked, if Parliament has unlimited amendment power, where does that power stop? Could Parliament abolish elections? Could it remove fundamental rights? Could it eliminate judicial independence? Could it transform democracy into something entirely different? A court feared that unlimited power might eventually threaten the Constitution in itself. A constitution must allow change, but it must also preserve its identity. Without limits, future governments could potentially rewrite the constitutional framework beyond recognition. The judges were not opposing reform, they were trying to determine whether any democratic system can safely function without constitutional boundaries. April 24, 1973, after 68 days of arguments, after months of constitutional debate, after countless hours of deliberation, the Supreme Court was finally ready to deliver its judgment. Across the nation, legal scholars, politicians, and constitutional expert waiting anxiously. Everyone understood that the decision would be historical. The court was about to answer questions that had troubled constitutional law for decades. The future balance between parliament and constitution was about to redefine. The judgment revealed how deeply divided this court had become. Seven judges formed a majority, six judges dissented. A single vote separated the two sides, one vote, one constitutional principle, one historic outcome. Rarely has a such narrow margin carried such enormous consequences. The court was divided because the questions themselves were extraordinarily difficult. Both sides believed they were protecting the constitution, both sides believed they were defending democracy. Yes, they reached different conclusions. The Supreme Court delivered a historical compromise. The court agreed with Parliament on one crucial point. Parliament thus possesses the power to amend the Constitution. Parliament can amend constitutional provisions. Parliament can amend fundamental rights. In this aspect, the court moved away from the restrictions position adopted in the Golak but the court also imposed an important limitation. Parliament's amendment power is not unlimited. Parliament cannot destroy the essential identity of constitution. This principle would soon become one of the most important doctrine in constitutional law. The constitution can change, but it cannot cease to be itself. This was the revolutionary idea introduced by the court, the British Structure Doctrine. The judges concluded that certain foundation principles from the core identity of Constitution. These principles may be amended, they may evolve, but they cannot be destroyed. Think of a tree. Branches can grow, new branches can emerge, old branches may be trimmed, but if the roots are destroyed, the tree dies. The Constitution is similar. Amendments may change its branches, but its roots must survive. Those roots became known as basic structure. This doctrine would forever transform India constitutional law, and in the years ahead, it would become one of the strongest safeguards of Indian democracy. The greatest constitutional battle had produced a historic answer, but an even more important question remained. What exactly constitutes the basic structure of the Constitution? So the Keshavananda Bharati judgment gave birth to a revolutionary constitutional principle, the basic structure doctrine. But what exactly does that mean? Did the Supreme Court create a fixed list? No, the court did not provide a complete list of every principle that formed part of the basic structure. Instead, over the years, through various judgments, several constitutional values came to be recognized as part of the Constitution's core identity. Think of think of the Constitution as a great building. Many rooms can be renovated, many sections can be expanded, but the pillars supporting the building cannot be removed. If the pillars collapse, the entire structure collapses. The basic structure doctrine protects those pillars. Let us now understand some of the most important pillars recognized by the Supreme Court. The first pillar is democracy. This may sound obvious. India is a democracy, but the Keshavananda Bharati judgment ensured that democracy itself could not be destroyed through constitutional amendment. In a democracy, ultimate power belongs to the people. Government come and go, political parties rise and fall, leaders change, but the people right to choose their government must remains protected. Imagine a future parliament decided to permanently cancel elections or declaring that only one political party may govern forever. Could such an amendment be valid? According to the basic structure doctrine, no, because democracy forms part of the constitution's basic structures. The constitution may be amended, but democratic government must survive. This principle protects every citizen's voice, every vote, and every election. The second pillar is the rule of law. Rule of law meaning that nobody is above the law, not ordinary citizens, not government officials, not ministers, not even prime minister. Everyone must act within legal boundaries. Without rule of law, power becomes arbitrary. Governments could act according to personal preferences rather than legal principles. The Constitution rejects such a system. Rule of law ensures fairness, predictability, and accountability. It guarantees that power must always operate within constitutional limits. This principle remains one of the foundation of every healthy democracy. The third pillar is judicial review. Judicial review gives a court the power to examine government actions and determine whether they completely comply with the constitution. Think of judicial review as the constitution's safely mechanism. Parliament makes laws, the execution implement laws, but the judicial ensures that those laws remains constitutional. Without judicial review, constitutional protections could become meaningless. A government might pass laws that violate rights, but it courts lack the authority to review those laws. Citizens would have little protection. The Supreme Court recognized that judicial review is essential to preserving constitutional government. This is why judicial review became part of the basic structure. It protects the constitution from misuse of power. The fourth pillar is federalism. India is neither a completely centralized nation or a loose collection of independent states. Instead, power is shared between the union government and state governments. This arrangement is known as federalism. The Constitution carefully distributed powers between these levels of government. Certain subjects belongs primarily to the union, other belongs primarily to the states. This balance helps manage India's extraordinary diversity. Different languages, different cultures, different religious priorities. Federalism allow local concerns to be addressed while preserving national unity. The Supreme Court recognized that destroying this balance would fundamentally alter the nation of the Constitution. Therefore, federalism became part of the basic structure. The fifth pillar is fundamental rights. Fundamental rights protects individual freedom. They safeguard citizens from accessing governmental power. These rights include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality before the law, protection of protection of life from liberty, and several other essential protections. The Constitution does not grant these rights as gift from the government. Rather, it recognizes them as a fundamental protections belongs to the citizens. The Keshavananda judgment did not declare that fundamental rights could never be amended. However, it ensured that their essential characters could not be destroyed. This distinction is extremely important. Amendment is possible, destruction is not. Another pillar of the basic structure is secularism. In India, secularism in India does not mean opposition to religion. Instead, it means equal respect for all religions. The state does not officially favor one religion over another. Citizens are free to practice, profess, and propagate their faith within constitutional limits. India's strength has always come from its diversity, different religions, different traditions, different cultures. The Constitution seeks to protect his diversity. The Supreme Court concluded that secularism forms an essential features of India's constitutional identity. Removing it would be fundamentally change the nature of republic. Therefore, secularism became part of the basic structure. The constitution creates three major branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Each branch has distinct responsibilities. Parliament creates laws, the executive implements laws, the judiciary interprets laws. This arrangement prevents excessive concentration of power. When power is distributed, accountability improves. No single institution can dominate the entire system. The basic structure doctrine protects its balance. The Constitution was designed to create cooperate between institutions, not domination by any one institution. This principle remains essential for constitutional stability. Perhaps the most human pillar of all is the dignity of the individual. The Constitution is not merely about governments and institutions, it is ultimately about people. Every citizen possesses inherent dignity. Every individual deserves respect. Every person deserves equal protection under the law. The Constitution seeks a protection of human liberty and human worth. This principle influences many constitutional rights and freedom. Without dignity, rights lose meaning. Without dignity, equality becomes incomplete. The Supreme Court recognized that protecting individual dignity lays at the heart of constitutional governance. Only 2 years after a Keshavananda Bharati judgment, India entered one of the most controversial periods in its history: the emergency. Declared in June 1975, the emergency dramatically expanded governmental authority. Political opposition was restricted. Civil liberties faced significant limitations. The relationship between government power and constitutional freedom came under intense strain. For many citizens, it was a period of uncertainty. For constitutional scholars, it became a critical test of India's democratic institutions. Would constitutional safeguards survive? Would democratic principles endure? The nation was about to find out. The emergencies tested every major constitutional institution. The press faced restrictions. Political leaders were detained. Questions arose regarding civil liberties and governmental authorities. Many constitutional protections appeared vulnerable. This period demonstrated why constitutional safeguards matter. It reminded the nation that democratic institutions cannot be taken for granted. Freedom often appears strongest when it is protected. Its importance becomes most visible when it is threatened. A constitution was now under enormous pressure. Yet the principle established in Keshavananda Bharati remained alive. waiting to play a crucial role. The rule significance of Keshavananda Bharati judgment became clear with time. The basic structure doctrine created a constitutional boundaries. It allowed amendments, but it prevented destruction. Governments could introduce change, but they could not eliminate the Constitution's core identity. Democracy remained protected, judicial review survived, federalism endured, fundamental constitutional values continued to exist. The doctrine created a balance between flexibility and stability. A constitution must evolve, but it must also preserve its soul. That is precisely what the basic structure doctrine achieved. For this reason, constitutional scholars around the world regards Keshavananda Bharati as one of the most important constitutional decisions ever delivered. The doctrine protected not only legal principles, it protected the future of constitutional democracies itself. And more than 50 years later, its influence continues. But the story does not end here. The doctrine would go on to shape future cases, future governments, and future generations. More than 50 years have passed since the Supreme Court delivered the Keshavananda Bharati judgment. Governments have changed, prime ministers have changed, political parties have changed. Generations have changed, but one thing has remained remarkably consistent: the influence of basic structure doctrine. The doctrine did not remain confined to law books. It became an active part of India's constitutional framework. Every major constitutional dispute that followed was influenced by the principle established in 1973. The judgment became more than a legal precedent. It became a constitutional compass, a guide that helped future courts determine whether the constitutional amendment respected the identity of the Constitution. Even today, even whenever constitutional amendments are changed, the shadow of Kesavananda Bharati remains present. The judgment continues to shape India's constitutional journey. The true power of landmark judgment is revealed through the case that follow, and few judgments have influenced as many important decisions as Keshavananda Bharati. One of the first major tests came in Indira Gandhi elections case 1975. The Supreme Court relied upon basic structure principle while examining constitutional amendments affecting elections. Then came the Minerva Mills case in 1980. This judgment reinforced the idea that Parliament's amendment power is limited. The court reaffirmed that constitutional balance must be preserved. In Vaman Rao, the court further clarified how basic structure principles should be applied. In S.R. Bommai, the court strengthened federalism and constitutional government. In I.R. Coelho, the court reinforced judicial review and constitutional protection. Again and again, court returned to the principle established in Kesavananda Bharati. The doctrine became the foundation of modern Indian constitutional law. Its influence extended far beyond the original case. At this point, some viewers may wonder, why should ordinary citizens care about a constitutional judgment delivered in 1973? The answer is simple: because the judgment affects every Indian citizen, every election you participate in, every right you enjoy, every constitutional protection you depend on, every democratic institution that serves the nation. The Keshavananda Bharati judgment helped ensure that no temporary majority can fundamentally destroy the constitution. It protects the democratic system itself. It protects constitutional accountability. It protects judicial independence. It protects the framework within which citizens exercise their freedoms. Most people may never read the full judgment. Yes, its impact reaches their daily lives, whether they realize it or not. This is why constitutional history matters. It helps us understand how freedoms are preserved and why they should never be taken for granted. When historians look back at constitutional history, a few moments stand above all others. The Keshavananda Bharati judgment is undoubtedly one of them. What began as a property dispute became a constitutional revolution. What became with a religious institution in Kerala became a national debate about democracy itself. The Supreme Court answers a question that continues to matter today. Can constitutional power be unlimited? The court's answers was clear: no. Parliament is powerful, governments are powerful, political majorities are powerful, but even power must operate within constitutional limit. The constitution can change, it can evolve, it can adapt, but it cannot lose its soul. That principle transformed India constitutional law forever, and that is why Keshavananda Bharati remains one of the most important judgment in the history of the democratic government. Before we conclude, let us quickly revisit the journey we have taken. 1947, India becomes independent. 1950, the Constitution comes to force. 1951, the Shankara Prasad case upholds Parliament's amendment powers. 1965, the Sajjan Singh case reaffirms that position. 1967, the Golaknath judgment restricts Parliament's ability to amend fundamental rights. 1971 Parliament responds through constitutional amendments. 1973 Keshavananda Bharati reaches the Supreme Court. The Basic Structure Doctrine is born. 1975 the emergency tests India's constitutional institutions. 1980 and beyond, future judgments strengthen and expand basic structure principles. And today, more than half a century later, the doctrine continues to shape constitutional law. This timeline reminds us that constitutional history is not a single event, it is the ongoing journey. What are the most important lessons we can learn from this historic judgment? Lesson 1: Parliament can amend the Constitution. The Constitution was designed to evolve with changing time. Lesson 2: Parliament's power is not unlimited. Constitutional authority must operate within the constitutional boundaries. Lesson 3: The basic structure cannot be destroyed. Certain principles from the Constitution's core identity. Lesson 4: Democracy requires safeguards. Elections alone are not enough. Institutions matter. Checks and balances matter. Constitutional values matters. Lesson 5: Freedom survive when constitutional principles survive. The protection of liberty depends upon the protection of constitutional foundations. These lessons remain just as relevant today as they were in 1973. They were in 1973. As we conclude this documentary, I wanted to return to something I mentioned at the beginning. Knowledge Byte is not only about technology. Technology is important. Artificial intelligence is important. Cloud computing is important. Emerging technologies are important. But knowledge is much broader than any single subject. History teaches us where we came from. Law teaches us how freedom is protected. Science teaches us how the world works. Technology teaches us how innovation transforms society. The purpose of Knowledge Bytes is to explore all these ideas, to learn continuously, to remain curious, and to shape that curiously with others, and to share that curiosity with others, because learning should never stop, no matter our profession, no matter our age, and no matter where life takes us.